Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Cyde. My name is Matt Fisher and today we are going to be looking at the 6 top reasons that software asset management tools disappoint and how you can be SAM happy. So as I said, my name is Matt Fisher and I'm the Chief Storyteller here at Cyde. I have 15 years experience in the SAM and ITAM industries and I'm a regular speaker at the Gartner, ITAM and IBSMA conferences. Let's start the presentation today with somewhat of a sobering statement from Gartner, and that is that through 2020, only 25% of enterprises will be satisfied that their software asset management tools deliver on pre-purchase expectations of value. Now, this was published in summer last year, and in less than a year's time, it's suggesting that 3/4 of SAM tools users will feel let down by their SAM tools selection or feel that their tool is not delivering the full amount of value that they expected to get from it. If we stick with Gartner for a second, you're probably familiar with the graph that I'm about to show on screen. It's called a Gartner hype cycle. You might know it by other names as well. Now you'll notice that towards the left of the graph, there's a peak. Now Gartner calls this the peak of expectation. And in a SAM sense, it's when you are just about to or have just purchased a SAM tool. You're very excited, full of anticipation about the value that that tool is going to deliver. However, what the Gartner research is showing, and this is borne out by our own experiences, is that shortly after the purchase of the SAM tool, you begin the descent, the somewhat steep descent into what Gartner calls the trough of disillusionment. You might know that as the valley of despair or the oh crap, that didn't work moment. Now, there are a number of reasons why you can drop into the trough of disillusionment, and we're going to go into 6 of those today. The good news is that you can climb out of the trough of disillusionment. And if we follow the line to the right, that upwards slope is called the slope of enlightenment. What we are going to try to do today is, for those organizations that have not yet invested in a SAM tool, give you some pointers that will hopefully help you avoid the trough of disillusionment altogether. And if you're unfortunate enough to find yourself either in or on your way towards the trough of disillusionment, give you some pointers as to how to accelerate the climb back out of that trough onto the slope of enlightenment. But before we begin, we'll continue with the rest of the presentation today, I'd just like to ask for a tiny bit of audience participation. You're about to see a poll on screen now, which asks where your organization is in regards to the Gartner hype cycle, the trough of disillusionment. So perhaps if you would be good enough just in the next few seconds to take a look at the options that are on screen and have a think about what best describes your organization's current status. Are you at the point where you're looking to actually buy a tool? Have you bought a tool, but you're just embarking on that journey? Have you dropped down into the trough of disillusionment? Are you on the slope of enlightenment? Or perhaps you're actually at a point where you feel like things are about as good as they possibly can be. So we'll just give you a couple of seconds to perhaps cast your votes there, if you wouldn't mind. A few more seconds and we'll close the poll. Okay, let's give that a close, and hopefully you'll be able to see some of the results on screen. If you're not able to, let me just change the view now so that you should indeed be able to see that. So the majority of people on the presentation today or on the webinar today are just at that trigger point. So great news, you're in a perfect position to look at what you should be doing going forward, and we'll definitely try and share some value with you on the next 15, 20 minutes or so. Some of you have just bought a tool, that's great. Let's give you some pointers as to how to get the most out of that. A couple, unfortunately, in that trough of disillusionment. Perhaps you'll sort of resonate with some of the messages that we're going to share, and some of you have been through that painful journey and are now on the slope of enlightenment, which is fantastic news. So if we go back to our presentation, we'll now look at some of those 6 key reasons why SAM tools disappoint. And these are 6 that we've collected through our own research, through our own interaction with different customer organizations, and of course, looking at third-party research as well. So number 1 is the limited toolset's capabilities. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a bit more detail, but introduce them quickly first. Second is when you don't get the levels of automation that you had been expecting. Third is when you're forced to use tools that are actually quite old and perhaps not as powerful as you would hope that they would be. Now, not necessarily a tools issue, but very closely linked to the tool is the lack of in-house skills that you might have. If you don't have the right skills, how can you get the most out of the tool? Something that's rife within the SAM industry and something that we're very critical here of at Cyde, which is vendor overpromising. And then finally, the perennial issue for a lot of SAM managers, which is how to prove the value of the great work that you're doing. So let's look at our 6 in turn. So let's start with limited toolsets capabilities. If you've been in the industry as long as I have, which is in other words far too long, you'll know that a lot of asset management tools have actually been born out of the Y2K issue, and funnily enough that was nearly 20 years ago now. And it means that really, if we think back to how our networks looked then, they look very different to how they are today. And that means that a lot of the tools are actually very focused on the low-hanging fruit on the Wintel environment. They were effectively created as desktop solutions. They're just about good on laptops and Windows servers now, but actually fairly poor at other parts of the network. So they're very limited in their capabilities on Linux, Unix, Macs, and some of the cloud platforms that we're starting to see. In fact, most SAM programs today don't even consider looking at mobile devices. So again, not surprisingly, the tools are not particularly capable on those platforms either. One of the things that we've seen a massive change of in licensing in general terms in the last 20 years is a really strong move from very simple device-based licensing metrics into more user-based, location-based, even consumption-based licensing metrics. And a lot of the SAM tools on the market are really struggling with these more current licensing metrics. And moreover, they're struggling when one application can be covered by multiple licensing metrics. So it might be that you have some licenses that were bought on a previous sort of device-based licensing scheme, whereas you've got more current versions of the same application that are actually now being licensed by consumption or user-based metrics. A lot of SAM tools really struggle when you're trying to apply multiple licensing metrics to the same application or even the same vendor. What are our top tips for SAM happiness? Well, we would strongly recommend that you've got to look at both your short-term and long-term goals. It's very easy to get suckered into thinking about only the low-hanging fruit. We all know about the examples of reclaiming Visio or project licenses and the superb savings that those can bring. Well, that's great for the first 3 or 6 months of your SAM program, but what are you going to do after that? Where do you go next, and what do you need the tool to do to support you? You also have to think about how you're going to deploy technology and what your evolving needs are going to look like. It is unlikely that your network will look much the same as it does today in 2 years' time. So think about your overall IT strategy And one of the things that we're seeing very strongly in the SAM market at the moment is the growing need of the growing number of stakeholders across the business who need access to the SAM data or ITAM data. So it used to be that licensing and inventory information was used by a much smaller group of people, but today we see procurement, finance, security, business operations all want access to that data. So think about how you can select a tool that's going to satisfy the need to share that information across the organization. Moving on, we can look at low levels of automation. Now, almost every SAM tool on the market will claim to be, quotes, highly automated. You'll see it on almost every website or data sheet. But what does that really mean? What's automated? Is it the inventory collection? Is it the data processing? Is it the upload of entitlements or the reconciliation and creation of an effective licensing position? Is it the optimization recommendations or indeed the action of the optimization recommendations? There are lots of different forms that automation can take, and it's really important to understand what is and is not automated within the tool sets that you're looking at. It also is really important to understand when to look beyond the marketing claims and work out when automation really means using a spreadsheet. It's a running joke in the software asset management industry that the world's most popular software asset management tool is actually Excel, because so many supposedly SAM specific tools force you to work outside of the product when you're doing license calculations, when you're calculating core cal factors or what have you. Really be mindful of how much work you're going to have to do outside the product, not what you're going to have to do in the product. Also be mindful of when automation actually requires multiple products to work together. There's a difference between vendors that have platforms that are built on a common architecture and a common code base, and vendors that have platforms that are actually made up of lots of different products, most of which they've probably acquired over the years, and have different code bases, different ways of working, and therefore require quite heavy integration work for data to pass and to workflows to be automated across those products. In terms of top tips for SAM happiness, we think it's really important that you, the customer, have to be very clear on your expectations of automation. Don't just be sold what the vendor sees as the ideal automation. Make your own case for what you believe is the most important areas for automation. And when you've decided what those use cases are, force the vendors to prove their claims against your use cases. So again, don't just be suckered into the pre-canned demo that the vendor has waiting for you. Actually challenge them to show you the parts of the product that are most important and relevant to the use cases you want to support. And finally, I would say look for platforms that have truly integrated modules and a common architecture. It's much cleaner, it's much easier to set up those automated workflows and to maintain them over time. If we think about the legacy tools architecture, if you think about what I just said about a lot of the asset management tools coming out of the Y2K issue, and that being 20 years ago, it's not that difficult to understand how a lot of the tools on the market actually have quite aging code bases. They were built at a time when products were designed, architected, and delivered in a different way to how we have them today. They weren't designed with cloud in mind. They weren't designed to be delivered as SaaS applications. So one of the things you need to think about is whether the application or the tool set that you're looking at is actually architected in a way that fits with your IT strategy going forward. Are they optimized for multi-platform, multi-location networks, or are they really just glorified desktop inventory tools? Now, where you make a bad decision, and clearly some of you on the call have been through this pain, it will increase the total cost of ownership and it will increase the administrative overhead. And that potentially takes away from the next point we're going to get onto, which is those lack of skills on the SAM team. So in terms of what you can do about it, really just don't just look at the features and functions of the tool, actually look at the code base and make sure that the technology is fit for your needs today and is also going to be fit for your needs in 2 or 3 years' time. I know it's November and it's probably a little early to be talking about Christmas, but it's worth bearing in mind that a SAM tool isn't only for Christmas. You need it to last you at least 3 or 4 years before you consider replacing it. Otherwise, your investment becomes a little bit jeopardized. cost. You need to scrutinize the vendor's claims for total cost of ownership, and you need to look at your overheads going forward for the hardware and the database requirements of your chosen technologies. Some are a lot lighter than others, some are a lot heavier than others. And then finally, choose the architecture that matches your IT strategy. Don't be straitjacketed into the vendor's way of working. Choose the way that suits your way of working. Now, we just referenced the lack of in-house skills, and I acknowledge that this isn't particularly a tools problem, but it's very aligned with your tools choice. So I think it's worth talking about for a few moments. I think it's fair to say that most SAM teams are typically understaffed. We generally see that SAM teams are somewhere between 4 and 6 people globally, and that's for all sizes of organization. If you're under 5,000 seats, typically your SAM team is going to be a lot smaller than that. And what we see time and time again is there's too much focus on the internal team on tools administration, making the actual SAM platform work. Now, there's a vast difference between making the platform work and actually deriving value from the insight that the platform should be providing to you. And so if you're stuck in tools administration, I would suggest you are probably not getting the most value that you could out of your tool because you're spending too much time on the admin and not enough time on the management reports and actually acting upon the insights that that tool should be providing to you. It's also worth remembering, and I say this every time I present, that automation is not always a replacement for skills and knowledge. I don't believe that the SAM industry will ever completely replace the Mark I human brain. Tools are getting clever, tools are getting better at applying automation and sort of inbuilt licensing expertise. We haven't really seen AI come on board in tools yet, but it'll come. But even then, I don't think it's a replacement for having SAM skills on staff. The key question for you is, what skills do you really need? And to that point, I would suggest that for SAM happiness, you should be looking at building a skills matrix and identifying where your gaps are. If your gaps are in tools administration, perhaps you should be asking whether you have the right tool, because I think your gaps actually are probably more on the value side rather than the admin side. You should then understand what skills can be automated, what can the product actually do and do well, not just do, with pay it lip service, what skills you perhaps should hire into the organization and which ones could be outsourced. If you take some vendor specific licensing like IBM or Oracle, for example, if you're a huge organization with huge investment in Oracle, perhaps it's worth you having those skills in-house. But for most organizations, that's an example of a licensing skill that could be outsourced and brought in when required, rather than being put on a full-time employee basis. To that extent, we would recommend looking at working with a technology vendor that offers what we call a blended service. And by blended, we mean that that vendor owns the technology and also owns the service delivery. Now, obviously, there are a lot of third-party SAM consultancies, SAM service delivery organizations out there. But when those organizations are working with technologies that they don't own, that can cause issues because they might not be any better at using that technology than you are. So consider you working with an organization that owns both the consultancy and the technology. It's the highest level of accountability that you can get. If we move on to number 5, this is a little bit of a contentious issue, but something that we believe strongly that exists in the market and has to be stamped out. And that's that there is a sense of over-promising on the SAM tools vendors' parts. I'm sure some of you have been in meetings where you're there with your sales guy from your SAM vendor, and of course they're answering yes to every question, and then they try and divert you into another area of the product that they want to show you rather than listening to your agenda. And I think it's worth remembering that the SAM tools vendors, by and large, have sold a lot more product than you have done projects. Some SAM tools vendors have sold hundreds, if not potentially thousands of their products, yet a really good experienced SAM manager might have done somewhere between 10 and 50 projects. So a very small portion of what the SAM vendor's done. So don't let the SAM vendor run the discussion. Make sure that you know what you're trying to achieve and you run it to your agenda. Sometimes the overpromising isn't immediately obvious, and that's because, of course, when you start with your SAM program, you often start with that low-hanging fruit that I talked about earlier. You want to show very quick results and value back to the organization, so you start where it's easiest to start. That sometimes means that you don't get to see some of the overpromising that happened during the sales cycle until you're 6 months, 12 months, 18 months into your SAM program, by which time you're really heavily invested in that tool set. You've kind of shown your sort of nailed your colors to the mast, as it were, and it's very difficult to reverse out of the decision. Now, I say it's difficult to reverse out a decision. I'd like to show you perhaps another time how it's not difficult to do that, but I sympathize with people that are in that position. Now, something that we hear time and time again from customers that we speak to, or customers of other tools, I should say, that we speak to, and we see it from Gartner as well, is that a perennial issue within the SAM industry is that a lot of customers are experiencing really slow response times on support calls from their vendors. And I think this is aligned to overpromising, partly because the vendors probably don't have the support functions that they need to have, because their number one issue or number one focus is customer growth, not customer success. But also, where overpromising happens, when you discover that overpromising and you start to challenge the vendor on it, they don't really know how to respond, because they know the product should do something, but they don't really know how to explain to you properly that it doesn't do it in the way that you were hoping for. In terms of SAM happiness, something again I advise everybody that I speak to is, don't ask if, ask how. And this applies to the in-person conversations, but also your RFIs as well. If you're issuing an RFI to a set of SAM tools vendors, don't ask if they can do something, ask them to explain how the product does it. You will much more likely uncover the marketing bluff versus the reality of the product. And to do that, you need to have your own use cases. You need to know what you are trying to achieve with the product. That's a bit of a running theme through the presentation. And then finally, speak to other long-term users of those shortlisted tools. Of course, the vendor will happily put a couple of happy customers in front of you, but perhaps consider doing your own research and see whether you can find other customers of those tools that perhaps will give you a more balanced opinion. Now, the last of our 6 is the inability to prove value. And again, you can argue that this is or isn't a tools issue. I think it's both, but it's a perennial issue for the SAM managers, and that it's kind of specifically tied back to, if your goals are unclear at the outset, they can be very difficult to track and they can be very difficult to prove. If your plan is too ambitious, it's more likely to fail. We see a lot of times where the business case has to be really ambitious to get the funding, but it's so ambitious that it's almost almost impossible to deliver against, because it is so far-reaching in its ambition. Now, to that extent, your goals or your tool has to be aligned to your goals. If your tool isn't specifically designed to meet the goals that you are setting for yourself, the reports, the management dashboards are not going to be oriented in the way that you need. And even if you're doing some fantastic work within the organization, it's going to be very difficult to demonstrate that fantastic work, to give the proof points to your sponsors and your stakeholders. And finally, just a contentious issue perhaps, but pre-canned reports are so 2010. Today, it's about self-service, and that's self-service for you as the SAM stakeholders, but it's also self-service for that growing base of stakeholders, business and technical, across the organization. I suspect you're seeing less and less demand for pre-canned reports and more demand for, I just want access to the data. I just want to do it myself. So you need to think about the management reporting, the dashboarding, and the analytics capabilities that you can provide in your SAM platform. So that means you need to define, communicate, and track your SAM goals. You need to ensure that the tools and the management reporting are tracking the right metrics, and look for those in-product analytic and custom reporting capabilities. Again, there's no point in trying to build a single SAM technology stack if you then have to introduce yet another technology to actually report on it. So those are our 6 key reasons. And again, a little bit of audience participation just for a moment. I'd like to ask, which of those reasons resonated with you? And you can choose all that apply. So hopefully coming up on screen in the next couple of seconds will be the poll. And the only one that's missing is the SAM skills, because I haven't met a SAM team yet that believes it has all the skills it needs in-house. So perhaps take a moment to read the options on screen and just give me your thoughts on which of those 5 reasons that are showing on screen are most resonant with you. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay, so while you guys keep voting, I'm just going to interpret some of the results that we're seeing on screen. And something I can see is that it's pretty widespread across the board. In fact, legacy perhaps is one of the least perceived problems, but in terms of the other issues, we're seeing a really widespread response. So 5 more seconds if you haven't got your vote in, and then I will share the results with you on screen so you can see them for yourselves. Okay, so now there you can see it on screen. So a really widespread selection. So it does seem that the 6 that I've presented are ones that do resonate with you guys on the call. So let's think about for a second what we would actually do about that. So let me just use my mouse properly. Okay. So if you're in the valley of despair, or if you're finding yourself sliding into it, what are our top tips for getting out? So as we've just seen, disappointment is rarely due to one reason. So I would look at the 6 reasons that we've presented and try to address as many of those as you can. You really want to be planning early to avoid that long-term disappointment. I know that when you get sign off to go to RFI, or when you're in the tool selection process, it can be really exciting and you want to just get cracking with the solution that looks most attractive. But I would suggest that it's well worth doing some proper due diligence to make sure that you're looking at your long-term goals. Be more demanding in your due diligence. Don't let the vendor own the full process. The vendor will probably have some very good POC processes, and I would suggest you look at those, and if you're happy with them, go with them. But if you're not happy with the POC or the onboarding process that's being recommended, make sure that you follow your agenda. And then finally, and this is for the people that find themselves in that trough of disillusionment, or perhaps are on the slope of enlightenment, don't flog a dead horse. At some point, you have to make the decision as to whether that technology is worth persevering with, or it's worth ripping out and replacing. No one can tell you when that point is. You have to work it out for yourself, but don't be afraid to kind of admit that it's time for a change. So in terms of a useful resource, one thing that we would highly recommend is something called the Gartner Peer Insights. It's a free web resource that simply, if you go and search on Google or Bing, if you prefer, for Gartner Peer Insights Software Asset Management, you will be presented with a list of software asset management tools and what the customers think of them. This is the most important point. This is not done by the analysts. It's not a magic quadrant. It's the peer insights, which means that all the ratings, all the quotes, all the opinions are from customers, and it gives you a better understanding of what the real world capability of the solutions are, what the real world experience of working with a vendor can be like. And it covers product capabilities, implementation and deployment, and also technical support, all of which are really important. And then finally, today, if you go into the handouts part of the dashboard, you'll get early access to our new ebook, which accompanies this webinar. We'll email you a link to that anyway, so if you don't pick it up straight after this, you'll get it very soon. I would also encourage you to speak to a specialist. Plenty of people here at Cyde who will happily talk about your situation, whether you are pre-purchase or whether you've got a SAM tool and you're struggling to make it happen. We're not against having a conversation with you about how we might be able to help you there. And of course, there's a lot of information on the Cyde website. Now, the only bit of sales that I'm going to do today is to say that you can be Sam happy and you deserve to be Sam happy. And at Cyde, we believe that every customer has a guarantee to be happy. So if you're interested in learning about our happiness guarantee, then have a conversation with a customer and we'll explain exactly what that means and why we think we're the only SAM tools vendor on the market that's behaving in this way, that's really guaranteeing our customer success. I hope today has been useful. I hope the 6 points have been insightful and given you some takeaways that you can take back to your organization. And I hope that you feel it's been a worthwhile use of the last 30 minutes. My name's Matt Fisher. Thank you very much for your attention today, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Have a great rest of the day.